have to be brief, so I'll be terse. Like a number of people who are students of religion, I've spent a lot of time lately, as you should if you have the opportunity, I recommend it very highly, with Professor Dermot McCulloch's History of Christianity. Marvelous work of scholarship and literature, written by a mainstream believer, extraordinarily broad and deep, in which he ponders one very important question, the only one I've got time for now. What happened to the word Christendom? Remember, there used to be such a term. It used to extend across the world, and the hope is that it would extend even further. And it was unironically used to mean those areas of human civilization, and areas yet to be civilized, of course, where the word of Jesus Christ reigned or would reign. And it's all gone. The word is never used except historically or sarcastically now. And McCulloch doesn't say it ended because of the Crusades, though he could. It didn't. Crusades didn't kill it. Not because of slavery, mandated by Christianity. That didn't kill it either. Nor the mass murder of colonial subjects in the yet-to-be Christianized world. That wasn't sufficient. It didn't really end, he said, till 1914, when all the Christian empires of the world, Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, Britain, France is a slight exception to this, but only a slight one, and Russia, all of them commanded by Christian emperors, and calling upon their subjects as Christians, went to war with each other and very nearly destroyed the whole human civilization, and certainly reduced it to a point where we can't guess where we might be if it hadn't been for this extraordinary outbreak of barbarism. And out of that came the terrors of fascism and of Stalinism, of which it was the seedbed as well. I mention this partly because I want to maintain that there's no such thing as a religion of peace by definition. And second, to point out, and that its best historian has to admit something that if I was a Christian would make me humiliated. But because there was another empire involved in that war, the Ottoman Empire, which also came to an end, its other name was the Caliphate, the Muslim Caliphate. It went to war on the side of German and Austrian imperialism and Hungarian imperialism, and it lost not just the war, having proclaimed a worldwide jihad against Christianity, except for German and Austrian and Hungarian Christianity, which were its allies. And it didn't just lose the war, but by 1924 had been dissolved by the Turkish leadership, by Ataturk. It lost the Caliphate. And that's the only one that still has supporters. The other Christian and religious empires have all gone. But the Caliphate still has fans, not just in the Muslim world, sometimes referred to by Muslims as the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, but also in what some Muslims call the Dar al-Harb, the House of War, the part of the world that isn't yet Muslim. There are Caliphate clubs in London now and Berlin and elsewhere, quite important ones. And what I want to know is why that is and what we should think about it. Believers in this fantasy have, Laurie's spared me the need to say much of this, have committed extraordinary atrocities in Istanbul, in Madrid, in India, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and of course in our own fair city. And the pretexts for it vary. They can be, the excuse for the mass murder can be that Australia has helped East Timor become independent from Indonesia. They can be that Newsweek has printed a false story about the desecration of a supposedly holy book. You never know what it's going to be next. But everyone knows to be careful about it, and everyone understands that the threat of violence that backs it is believable. And that's my opening position. Now you will say, I can hear it already being said, you may be saying it already to yourselves because the defense mechanisms kick in. And in any case, Laurie already said it for you. And I hope Professor Ramadan won't feel the need to say it again, but if he does, fair enough. You may say, that's not the real Islam. Those aren't real Muslims. Now, isn't that a fascinating objection? Is there anyone in this room, I exempt Professor Ramadan because it's his turn to speak next, is there anyone in this room who would care to arbitrate that question? Who is to say Where is the authority that defines who is a true son of the prophet or a true interpreter of his work? Part of the problem to begin with, and it's part of the problem because it is a religion, is that it's perfectly true to say we don't know who the true Muslims are. How right that is, who does speak for it. Only the second problem with defining Islam as peaceful, only the second problem with defining it as peaceful has to do with the fact that it's highly fissile and highly schismatic, that there is a civil war going on within it, the religion of peace. As we speak, at least one civil war between the votaries of this religion of peace is already taking place, and some of it is exported outside that world into ours, very salient fact. The first reason, though, is this. Islam makes very large claims for itself, very large claims indeed. It claims to be the last and final religion, the last and final revelation. When you see bumper stickers, everyone says you can't reduce major things to a bumper sticker. It's not my idea to have bumper stickers saying Islam is the solution. It's a well-known slogan, actually, of parties associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. They say Islam is the solution for everything. It takes care of all your life and the one to come. Sexuality, political economy, banking, diet, relations with other religions, everything. It's a total solution. What is creepy about the word total? I hope I don't have to tell an audience like this. It's the first 5 letters of the word totalitarian. It's absolute. It's absolute. It's all-inclusive. It's unanswerable. And oddly, for a religion that makes such large claims, notice another thing about Islam, it doesn't particularly like having these claims questioned or scrutinized. In other words, just as there is with all religions an inverse relationship between the claims they make and the evidence they can produce for them, you must have noticed that, with Islam, a younger religion, and perhaps therefore more in its first flush, there's an extraordinarily strong willingness to say that any challenge to its absolutist claims is by definition profane. And profanity and blasphemy can be the antecedent to very severe punishment, and often are, for Muslims and for non-Muslims. And this is not a road of peace in my submission. Thus my first point completed. The claim to govern everything from hygiene to sex and the afterlife, which contains detailed prescriptions for the good and bad versions of itself, again strikes me as somewhat totalitarian, and they're both based upon two very, very questionable and not very peaceful concepts. One is the idea of a perfect human being, the Prophet Muhammad, and the other is the idea of a perfect book, the Quran, the recitation. Now, the category perfect human primate or mammal and the category flawless book that could possibly not use any kind of change, revision, or editing are categories that do not exist. There are no members of these categories. Therefore, any challenge to this faith is bound to lead to heresy and to schism, and does. And just as all forms of absolutism and totalitarianism, leader worship and revealed truth, unalterable text, always do, because they can break, perhaps, but they cannot bend. And thus the latent potential of violence between them, among them, as well as within them, is very great. And at any moment, someone is in danger of being accused of being an apostate or an unbeliever. This week, the Coptic Pope of Egypt, Pope Shenouda, who represents 10 million Egyptians, was hustled onto Egyptian TV. He's not asked on all that often. I don't think he was even asked on this time. I think he was told he'd better come on. Why is the leader of Egypt's huge Christian minority suddenly compelled to make a TV appearance? Because one of his bishops had said in an interview that he thought that some of the verses of the Quran showed signs of having been added later on and to have been later accretion. And Pope Shenouda was forced onto the television to say, it's not that that didn't happen, it's it couldn't have happened. It shouldn't even be discussed. So that it has to be claimed even by non-Muslim subjects of a Muslim state that there is, after all, because no Christian claims this about the Bible anymore, and no Jew claims it about the Pentateuch. After all, yes, there is just one book that's completely word and letter perfect from the first time it was not even written down, but recited. Now, demands that you believe the impossible do not lead to peaceful outcomes, nor do they lead to peaceful or tolerant regimes. And I'm not going to ask you which Muslim country you would like to live in. I don't know whether Professor Ramana will tell us which one he would pick if he had to, because I don't have to ask you a question like that, because it's already in your mind.
Can you wind up now?
Yes, I can. I can, yes, and will. Shall, in fact. Sexual repression doesn't lead to peace. The idea that women are inferior to men is a profound cause of unease, let's say the least of it. All religions make some form of this claim. Islam seems to make it less apologetically than most. Claims that the world will come to an end in an apocalyptic form, which will lead to the victory of one religion or another, are not peaceful either. It's possible, perhaps, I haven't exhausted all my remarks, that the endless teaching of battle stories to children and the stories of lethal feuds from 7th century Arabia don't lead to peace, or the forcing of children to memorize and retell such stories by rote doesn't lead to peace either. It's arguable that peace isn't attainable at all. It may be arguable in some forms, that sometimes in places that religion isn't even desirable, but it will not come by the fanatical adoption of a man-made text and a man-made supreme leader. Nothing but war and tyranny has ever come from the adoption of formulae like these. The only way to moral and intellectual satisfaction, even temporary, perhaps only temporary, but of any kind at all, comes to those who are willing to take the great risk of thinking for themselves at all hazards and trying to share the benefits of that tolerance and that open-mindedness with others. And with that, for now, I'll rest my case. Thank you very much. Yes. Please.
If there is no God, why do you spend your whole life trying to convince people that there isn't?
Well, it isn't my whole career, for one thing. It's become a major preoccupation of my life, though, in the last 8 or 9 years, especially since September 11, 2001, to try and help generate an opposition to theocracy and its depredations internationally. That is now probably my main political preoccupation, to help people in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Israel, resist those who sincerely want to encompass the destruction of civilization and sincerely believe they have God on their side in wanting to do so. Maybe I will take a few minutes just to say something that I find repulsive about especially monotheistic, messianic religion. With a large part of itself, it quite clearly wants us all to die. It wants this world to come to an end. You can tell the yearning for things to be over whenever you read any of its real texts or listen to any of its real, authentic spokesmen, not the sort of the pathetic apologists who sometimes masquerade for it. Those who talk, there was a famous spokesman for this in Virginia until recently, about the rapture, say that those of us who have chosen rightly will be gathered to the arms of Jesus, leaving all of the rest of you behind. If we're in a car, it's your lookout. That car won't have a driver anymore. If we're a pilot, that's your lookout. That plane will crash. We will be with Jesus, and the rest of you can go straight to hell. The eschatological element that is inseparable from Christianity. If you don't believe that there is to be an apocalypse, there is going to be an end, a separation of the sheep and the goats, a condemnation, a final one, then you're not really a believer. And the contempt for the things of this world shows through all of them. It's well put in an old rhyme from an English exclusive brethren sect. It says that we are the pure and chosen few, and all the rest are damned. There's room enough in hell for you. We don't want heaven crammed. You can tell it when you see the extreme Muslims talk. They cannot wait. They cannot wait for death and destruction to overtake and overwhelm the world. They can't wait for what I would call, without ambiguity, a final solution. When you look at the Israeli settlers, paid for often by American tax dollars, deciding if they can steal enough land from other people and get all the Jews into the promised land and all the non-Jews out of it, then finally the Jewish people will be worthy of the return of the Messiah. And there are Christians in this country who consider it their job to help this happen so that Armageddon can occur, so that the painful business of living as humans and studying civilization and trying to acquire learning and knowledge and health and medicine and to push back can all be scrapped, and the cult of death can take over. That, to me, is a hideous thing in eschatological terms, in end times terms, on its own, a hateful idea, a hateful practice, and a hateful theory, but very much to be opposed in our daily lives, where there are people who sincerely mean it, who want to ruin the good relations that could exist between different peoples, nations, races, countries, tribes, ethnicities, who openly say they love death more than we love life, and who are betting that with God on their side, they're right about that. So when I say, as the subtitle of my book, that I think religion poisons everything, I'm not just doing what publishers like and coming up with a provocative subtitle. I mean to say it infects us in our most basic integrity. It says we can't be moral without Big Brother, without a totalitarian permission. It means we can't be good to one another. It means we can't think without this. We must be afraid. We must also be forced to love someone who we fear. The essence of sadomasochism. The essence of abjection. The essence of the master-slave relationship. And that knows that death is coming and can't wait to bring it on. I say this is evil. There is a terminological problem here, which may conceal more than just terminological difficulty. The proposition that atheism is true, or that is a misstatement of what I have to prove and what we believe. There's an argument among some of us as to whether we need the word at all. In other words, I don't have a special name for my unbelief in tooth fairies, say, or witches, or in Santa Claus. I just don't think that they're there. I don't have to prove a tooth fairyism. I don't have to prove a Santa Clausism. I don't have to prove a witchism. It's just, I have to say, I think that those who do believe these things have never been able to make a plausible or intelligible case for doing so. That's not agnosticism, because it seems to me that if you don't think there is any evidence, you're wrong to take refuge in saying you're neutral. You ought to have the courage to answer the question, which one is regularly asked, are you an atheist or not? Yes, I will say, I am. You can't tell anything else about me. You can't tell anything else about what I think, about what I believe, about what my politics are, or my other convictions. It's just that I don't believe in the existence of a supernatural dimension, and I've never been shown any evidence that any process observable to us cannot be explained by more satisfactory and more convincing means. The great physicist Laplace, when showing his working model of the solar system to the Emperor Napoleon, was asked, well, your model seems to have no room for a god in it, for deity. And he said, well, Your Majesty, it still all operates without that assumption. Now, here's what you would have to believe if you thought that this was all designed. Dr. Craig gave a slight parody of what I think about this. It could be true, but you'd have to imagine, let's say the human species has been, Homo sapiens has been with us, some people say as long as 250,000 years, some say 200, some say 100,000. Francis Collins and Richard Dawkins oscillate about this. It's not a very big argument. I'll just take 100,000, if you like. You have to imagine that human beings are born. Well, actually, most of them, a good number of them aren't born. They die in childbirth or don't long outlive it. They're born into a terrifying world of
of the unknown. Everything is a mystery to them, everything from disease to volcanic eruptions. Everything is, their life expectancy for the first, I don't know, many tens of thousands of years would be lucky to be in the 20s, probably dying agonizingly over their teeth, poorly evolved as the teeth are, and from other inheritances from being primates, such as the appendix that we don't need, such as the fact that our genitalia appear to have been designed by a committee, other shortcomings of the species, exaggerated by scarcity, by war, by famine, by competition, and so on. And for 98,000 years or so, heaven watches this with complete indifference. And then, we know where your children go to school, by the way. Heaven watches this with total indifference, and then, with 2,000 years to go on the clock, thinks, actually, it's time we intervened. We can't go on like this. Why don't we have someone tortured to death in Bronze Age Palestine? That should teach them. That should give them the chance of redemption. You're free to believe that, but I think the designer who thought of doing it that way was a very cruel, capricious, random, bungling, and incompetent one. The news of this, Dr. Craig talks as if, okay, but since then there have been more people born, so it might have been a good time in terms of population growth. Well, there are a huge number of people in the world who still haven't even heard of this idea. The news hasn't penetrated to them. Or where it has, it's been brought to them by people who Dr. Craig doesn't think of as Christians, such as Mormons, for example. And it's taught to them in many discrepant and competitive and indeed incompatible and violently irreconcilable ways. And there's been a lot of argument in the church and the churches all this time about, well, okay, what is the answer to that? What about all the people who never could have heard the good news, or who never will hear it, or still haven't been reached by it, and who've died not knowing about it? What happens to them? How can they be saved? Well, the argument is that it's all somehow made retrospective. And as with so many of these arguments, I just comment on these, well, how convenient. Because if you're willing to make assumptions of this kind, then really evidence is only ancillary to what you are advancing. Now, I didn't have the chance. Oh, and just on Mr. Wright, sorry, I scrawled a note to myself. In your first round, Doctor, you said that N.T. Wright, who's an impressive person, says that no explanation of the success of Christianity is possible that doesn't rest on the terms of its being true. In other words, Wright says it was so successful, it must have been, and the people were so strongly motivated to believe it that it must have been true. I regard that as a very, very unsafe assumption. Or if it is a safe one, then it must surely apply to Islam and to Mormonism. I mean, these are two very, very, very fast-growing religions, have people prepared to sacrifice enormously for it, have ancestors who were absolutely determined of the truth of it at the time, and who made extraordinary conquests in its name. If you're going to grant this for one religion, it seems to me you have to be willing, not just willing, you may indeed be compelled to make this concession for all of them. And that, I think, would be not just an unsafe assumption, but for most of you here, a distinctly unwelcome one. Now, I didn't get the chance, because I out-talked myself, and I'm sorry for it, to get to the moral dimension. And I'm interested that the word objective morality is the one that Dr. Craig chooses. Usually arguments about morality are whether morality is, so to say, absolute, or whether it's relative. As to objectivity, I think it's a very good compromise word, by the way, and I'm very happy to accept it. But the problem with morality is this, in respect of religion. You can't prove that anyone behaves any better if they refer this problem upward to a supreme dictator of a celestial kind. There are two questions that I've asked in public, and I'll try them again, because I try them on every audience. They're very simple ones. First, you have to name for me, or challenges, let's say, rather than questions. You have to name for me an ethical action or an ethical statement, or moral action, moral statement made or undertaken by a believer that I couldn't undertake or say, I couldn't state or do. I haven't yet had an example pointed out of that to me. In other words, that a person of faith would have an advantage by being able to call upon divine sanction. Whereas if I ask you to think of a wicked act undertaken by someone in the name of God or because of their faith, you wouldn't have, or a wicked statement made, you wouldn't have that much difficulty, I think, in coming up with an example right away. The genital mutilation community, for example, is almost exclusively religious. The suicide bombing community is almost exclusively religious. There are injunctions for genocide in the Old Testament. There are injunctions and warrants for slavery and racism in the Old Testament too. There's simply no way of deriving morality and ethics from the supernatural. When we come to the question of the absolute, well, the most often cited one is the Golden Rule, the one that almost everyone feels they have in common. The injunction not to do to others as you wouldn't want them to do to you. This doesn't, in fact, come from the Sermon on the Mount or from Christianity, or it doesn't originate with it. It's certainly adumbrated by Rabbi Hillel, a Babylonian rabbi, and it's to be found in the Analects of Confucius too. But it has, since we're talking about objective, relative, and absolute, a crucial weakness in it, unfortunately. We'd like to be able to follow it, but it's only really as good as the person who's uttering it. In other words, if I say, I won't treat you as I don't want you to treat me, what am I to do when confronted with Charles Manson? I want him treated in a way that I wouldn't want to be treated myself. Anything else would surely be completely relativistic. So the argument isn't at all advanced by saying that I couldn't know any of this. I couldn't have any moral promptings. I couldn't decide for myself if I see a pregnant woman being kicked in the stomach, that because she's pregnant, that's obviously worse than if it was just a woman who wasn't pregnant being kicked in the stomach. This is part of my patrimony as a human being. It's part of the essential emotional solidarity that I need to have with my fellow creatures to make us realize that we are brothers and sisters, one with another. We are dependent upon each other. We have duties. We have expectations of one another. And that if we didn't have these and try and fulfill them, we couldn't have got as far as we have. We couldn't have evolved as a species. We couldn't have ever had a society. There's never been a society found where rape and murder and perjury are not condemned. And these moral discoveries long, or absolutes if you want to call them that, long predate the arrival of anything recognizable as monotheism. It's a bit like the argument of free will. People say, well, how do you have free will? Do you think you do have it? Well, it's a very, very difficult subject indeed. Some religions say you don't, in effect, have it, that all is determined by heaven. You're really only a plaything in a larger game. I take that to be some of the point of Calvinism. There are some schools of Islam also that say it is only as Allah wills. There's no will of yours really involved, as long as you're willing to make the prostration and the obedience. So the connection between religion and free will isn't as simple, as easy as some people like to think it is. But I would say, yes, I think we have free will. When asked why I think so, I would have to take refuge in philosophical irony and say, because I don't think we have any choice but to have free will. But at least I know at this point that I'm being ironic, and that some of the irony is at my own expense, and it's a risk I have to be willing to run. But the Christian answer is, of course you have free will. The boss insists upon it. This somewhat degrades the freedom and redefines the idea of will. And it seems to me also that there's something degrading in the idea of saying that morality is derived in the same way, that it comes from on high, that we ourselves are not good enough, that we don't have the dignity, we don't have the self-respect, we don't have the character to know a right action or a right statement when we see it or when we want to perform it. It's this servile element in religion. It's not, strictly speaking, the subject of our debate this evening, I know, but I'm damned if I completely forego it. It's the idea that buried in the religious impulse is actually the wish to be unfree, is the wish for an immovable, unchangeable, celestial authority, a kind of heavenly North Korea that will take our decisions away from us and commit us only to worship and praise and thank a great leader and his son, the dear leader, forever and ever and ever. I'm so glad there's no evidence that this is true. Thank you.
To talk about Hitchens is to talk about a force of nature, a man who wielded the English language not like a scalpel, but like a broadsword man with equal parts, intelligence, wit, and glorious unapologetic fury. While others in the so-called new atheism movement made intellectual arguments, Hitchens made war, and His battlefield was everywhere, man. Debate stages, television studios, and written pages. And sometimes the bar. He didn't just want to convince you that religion was false. He wanted you to see that it was a poison, a stain on human civilization, and he did it with a style so compelling that you couldn't look away even if you flinched, man. And as you've just seen in the videos, ladies and gentlemen, Hitchens' atheism wasn't just a quiet philosophical position, it was a full-throated rebellion, man. He famously declared that the central message of his work was the simple, liberating idea that religion poisons everything, which wasn't hyperbole to him, it was actually a historical fact. He would usually trace his fingers through the bloodstains of history, from the Crusades to the Inquisition to the modern-day sectarian violence, and laid the blame squarely at the feet of faith. He argued that religion granted a divine permission slip for the very worst behaviors, bigotry, oppression, and even violence, all while offering a get out of jail free card for the conscience of those involved. Even worse, to Hitch, the religious moderates who cherry-picked the nice parts of their holy books were no different from the zealots. These moderates, according to Hitchens, were just enablers providing cover for the fundamentalists who took these same books super seriously. Now, most of you might be familiar with Christopher Hitchens' book, masterpiece, which is called God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. And in the book, he doesn't just tackle the logical fallacies of belief, he eviscerates its moral core, basically. He attacks the ugly and absurd story of the crucifixion, a tale he saw as divine child abuse. And he also rails against the immoral doctrine of substitutionary atonement, the idea that a scapegoat can absolve you of your sins, and he exposes the petty, provincial, and often shockingly cruel nature of the supposed perfect moral arbiter of the Bible. And one other thing is obvious when you read his book. He did his homework and he came armed not with just philosophy but with scripture, history, and a devastating command of his opponents on sources, man. But what truly sets Hitchens apart was the performance of his unbelief. Watching him debate was a masterclass in intellectual combat, with a glass of whiskey often in one hand, a smirk playing on his lip, and a mind like a steel trap. He would dismantle theologians and apologists with a breathtaking combination of rhetorical flair and sheer unadulterated nerve, man. He was fearless, taking on the most revered figures and sacred cows. Actually, his legendary takedowns of figures like Mother Teresa, whom he labeled a fanatic and a fraud. His takedowns of these holy figures was shocking but needed, man. He basically refused to grant anyone a pass on the basis of piety. And that's why most of us still remember his contributions to this day, man. Anyway, that was it, ladies and gentlemen. I really hope that you've enjoyed the video as much as I did putting it together, man. Please, if you liked it, leave a comment below and let me know what you think in the comment section, man. Peace.